Right. Today we're talking about single grain scotch, specifically single grain scotch. And I was going to drink a single grain, but then I realized the majority of the people watching this video probably can't get their hands on a single grain scotch. They're not very common. So instead, I'm going to drink a great blended scotch that its base is single grain scotch, and you're going to understand what I'm talking about. So, under the regulations that we talked about, historically, you have in Scotland, single malt and single grain are the two base parent products, right? And we already talked about single malt is 100% barley made on pot stills at one distillery, and then you've got the range of proof levels and things like that. Aged 3 years in oak, minimum. Single grain, again, we talked about this a little bit when we did the 5 parent categories, so this is a reminder. Single grain is a mix of grains, will also include malted barley, but can include any other grain, wheat, rye, corn. And here's the kicker. Almost always, as in like 98% of the time, distilled on a column still. Now, we'll talk column still production at some point. Did we do column still? I think we did pot still. Yeah, we did column still. I'll have to link to these things. I can never remember. Anyway, so column still. As you remember, column still gets you a much higher fractional distillation rate and strips a whole bunch of the stuff from it. So what comes out is much less chemical compounds and higher proof much more quickly. Also, crazy efficient. Way more efficient than let's fill a pot, let's heat it up, let's make cuts, let's collect it, let's water it down, let's put it back in the pot, let's heat it up, let's make cuts. It's like, okay, you can either do double pot distillation and you get all those flavors, sure. Or you can do this column, and the column still will do all of that in one freaking run. And then you can run it continuously. They're called a continuous column still. As long as you can feed beer into it, you can keep running that thing. So they showed up around the turn of the century, 1800s to the early 1900s, and it was actually a little earlier than that. It was like 1830. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot when Aeneas Coffey invented the column still. Oh, whiskey psalms are gonna have my head, but I'm in the moment and I'm thinking about something totally different. I think it's 1832? 1830? Anyway, around the era of the Industrial Revolution, you get the invention of a whole bunch of new industrial production techniques, and one of them is column distillation. It was called the patent still originally, and people like Robert Stein and then the Haig family made use of it, and then Aeneas Coffey perfected one, and the coffee still is still in existence, a couple of them. And then we get the modern versions, even more efficient. But at the time, what happened was it enabled you to make continuous product really fast, really high proof, and you could, because you were stripping most of the flavor out of it, you could kind of use any grain you could get your hands on. You didn't have to use malted barley. Now, you did for the conversion process, so it always had to include malted barley, but you didn't have to for the bulk of the grain. And so you get cheaper grain and cheaper production, and it leads to cheaper whiskey. Now, many would argue cheaper tasting whiskey. But it was around 1909, and I'm actually going to tell a whole story about this at some point in the video. There was a Royal Commission. In 1909, the Royal Commission rules that grain whiskey, made on a column still with a mix of grains, is also whiskey. And they distinguish between grain whiskey and malt whiskey. Now, it was considered a huge failure by the Highland malt distillers. But all the big producers, the Walkers and the Dewars and the blending companies, they all were like, yes, okay, good, we're good. And people Camus spent crazy amounts of money on marketing campaigns on both sides. One labeling one the silent spirit and one labeling the other one an inferior, cluttered, unclean, impure product. Oh, it was chaos. And the story's great. I'm going to tell it at some point. But you have to remember that grain whiskey, even though it doesn't meet those same qualifications as malt, it still has the whiskey requirements of Scotland, which means it still has to be grain, it still has to taste like whiskey, and it still has to be aged a minimum of 3 years. Now, we're going to talk about what that means today. But first, Dewar's 12-year-old. We've done this one ages ago, but it's been a while. So, I'm a fan of Dewar's as a good budget blend. Like, in general, if I'm at a bar and all they have is blended Scotch, I will look for the Dewar's label. I'll look for the Walker label. If they've got certain kinds of Chivas, I'll look for those. I'm totally fine with blended Scotch. And remember, blended Scotch means a mix of grain and malt, right? So they do something that is done in the industry, but they've really sort of said, this is our thing, and they've gone on talking about it, which is they use marrying casks. And so they'll create their blends, and I remember correctly, was it Stephanie McLeod is their blender? Anyway, they'll create these blends, and once they've got it, instead of just immediately bottling it, like a lot of blenders do, they will put it back into barrels in order to just sit and settle and become one cohesive thing, and then they'll bottle it. It's called cask marrying, or finishing maturation, or like there's a bunch of different words. They use the term married in oak casks, and when they say that, that's what they're talking about, which is they took 12-year-old Scotch out, mixed it all together, and put it back into barrels for another anywhere from 6+ months. And I do think that when you try, maybe it's psychosomatic, but when you try side by side a lot of these blends, one thing you get from Dewar's is this sort of cohesive quality instead of this fractured thin quality. I can only guess that it's coming from that process. Oh, what I love about Dewar's 12 is that it has body and weight to it in a way that a lot of blends don't. It's still a little thin, it's still a little shiny, but there's also kind of a mustiness. Again, I really, okay, so you guys don't know this, but I shoot these in bulk. You probably have guessed. I shoot 4 episodes at a time. And so off to my right, your left, is whiskeys from previous episodes as I'm trying any whiskey. And right now, my tasting notes in this glass, in the nose, are identical to the Glenbretton 10 that I just tried. So I'm gonna get it real quick. I've never done this before. I'm gonna break the fourth wall at a certain level. I mean, I'm always breaking the fourth wall, but maybe the fifth wall. Okay, color difference, much darker, but color can be added in Scottish whiskey. I don't know if that's pure, but son of a, that's not so close. Oh, okay, I feel better. I thought I was going crazy. So it is a little more dense honey and a little more musty. The Dewar's 12, a little more musty, a little more honey. The Glenbretton feels a little more fruity and a little younger, because even though it's only by 2 years, there's more of a depth to this one, like it feels gentle in Dewar's in the nose. That is so weird. That is so weird. Wow. Glenbretton, did you know that your whiskey is almost right on the money, within 20 percentile off of Dewar's 12? Okay, and there's the difference. Okay. Whoa! Okay, it's only in the nose. On the palate, the Glenbretton just hits a wall on the palate, like I said. The Dewar's 12 rolls all the way through the palate. And that's where you get the difference. Oh yeah. There's a little ashiness around the edges, but that honey cream rolls all the way through and just sort of glides down. It feels smooth on the tongue. The aftertaste is ashy honey. But for a blend, I mean, that's solid. That's a good one. Okay, so why do I want to talk about grain now? Because as whiskey got nerdy and cool and And there was a window from like the 1960s, 70s through to now where Highland and single malt sort of exploded back into the world. And now we live in a world where all the whiskey drinkers talk single malt, single malt, single malt when they talk Scotch. And blends have sort of fallen out of fashion for the last 20 years. I think there's a turnaround on that. I think people like Compass Box and other independent bottlers who are blending things together, even SMWS, the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society, who has created some blends, and then American blenders. I think we're sort of turning the tide on people giving a little bit of respect to blends. It has not yet reached the general consumer market, where the general whiskey drinker, they still are like, blended Scotch, that's bullshit, give me a single malt. And that's fair. But I would argue that this is a good rule when you're trying to explain grain whiskey to people in a blend. If you have a cheap, budget, crappy tasting Scotch, it's probably blended Scotch. But not all blended Scotch is cheap and budget and crappy. How's that for a... Now, it was really the big dogs in the early blending and early adopters of grain whiskey, where you had Dewar's and Chivas and Johnny Walker family, and they were taking the budget and then they were mixing malt to add flavor and character, and that spirit has really stayed alive for the last 100 years. It's still going on. It's still resulting in Dewar's 12. It's still a highly respected category. Actually, I would argue now it's way more respected than it was even then. It's an art form. And I am grateful that for all the really crappy budget blended scotches that we have on the market, we also have really great, solid solid whiskeys, solid drinkable whiskeys in the blended category that, as single malts get more expensive and more expensive and more expensive, you can still go get a $30, $20, $25 of 12-year-old blended Scotch, and it still tastes damn fine. So make room in your heart for blends. They're not all meant for cocktails and soda and ice. And I'm really glad you're here. Cheers. Reach down in that marrying cask, swish it around a little, and blend up a like and subscribe. Huh?